From New York, this is Democracy Now!
My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men.
Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fires back at Florida Congressmember Ted Yoho after he called the Congresswoman an effing B-word, but he used the words. We'll bring you AOC's full speech from the floor of the House. Then, as President Trump says he's sending a surge of federal agents to Democrat-run cities, we'll spend the rest of the hour with world-renowned dissident Professor Noam Chomsky.
President Trump is desperate. His entire attention there's one issue on his mind, that's the election. He has to cover up for the fact that he's personally responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans. It's impossible to conceal that much longer.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a major reversal, President Trump has canceled the Republican National Convention in Jacksonville due to the surge in coronavirus cases in Florida.
The timing for this event is not right. It's just not right with what's happened recently, the flare-up in Florida. To have a big convention is not the right time.
Last month, Trump moved much of the convention to Jacksonville from Charlotte after North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper rejected requests from the president and the RNC to be able to hold a full convention without social distancing or masks. Trump canceled the Jacksonville RNC. On the same day, Florida reported more than 10,000 new COVID-19 cases and a record 173 deaths, including a 9-year-old girl. Despite canceling the convention due to the dangers of the coronavirus, President Trump has called again for schools to fully reopen in the fall. But at least one school that will not be doing that is St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Maryland, where Trump's son Barron attends classes. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued new guidelines Thursday, emphasizing the importance for schools to reopen, saying children face social, emotional, and mental risks if kept at home. The CDC guidelines make no reference to the risks teachers and staff will face if schools reopen during a pandemic. Nationwide, the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases has topped 4 million, as the number of cases has doubled over the past 6 weeks. Another 1,000 deaths were reported on Thursday, bringing the U.S. death toll to over 144,000, a quarter of the deaths in the world due to COVID-19, yet the United States has less than 5% of the world's population. In international news, South Africa's closed its schools for a second time as coronavirus cases top 40,000. More than 6,000 people have died, the highest total in Africa. On Thursday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the nation.
The next few weeks will put our resources and resolve to the test as never before, and I call on all South Africans to remain strong.
Another 1.4 million people filed for unemployment last week in the United States. It marks the 18th week in a row when more than 1 million people filed jobless claims in a single week. For the past 4 months, unemployed workers have received an extra $600 in weekly benefits, but that program is about to expire. Meanwhile, a 4-month moratorium on evictions under the CARES Act expires today. Princeton University's eviction lab predicts as many as 28 million people could be evicted in the coming months. In immigration news, 2 whistleblowers at an ICE prison in Louisiana have revealed officers have knowingly deported immigrants who had temperatures as high as 103 degrees Fahrenheit and likely had COVID-19 by deceptively covering up their symptoms. Under ICE policy, immigrants with temperatures above 99 degrees Fahrenheit cannot be deported. But one of the whistleblowers says staff was instructed to blast an air conditioner to, quote, freeze them out so sick immigrants could pass the temperature check in order to be deported. The U.S. continued to deport thousands of people despite their symptoms, contributing to a rapid spread of COVID-19 in Central America and Haiti. The whistleblowers work at the privately run Richwood Correctional Center in Louisiana, where at least 69 people have tested positive. 2 guards have died. Mother Jones reports the whistleblowers also allege LaSalle Corrections, the private prison company that runs Richwood, prohibited staff from wearing protective personal equipment, forced guards who likely had COVID-19 to work while awaiting their test results, and regularly exposed healthy prisoners to people who had been exposed. In related news, 2 filmmakers who embedded with ICE for over 2 years say the agency threatened to censor parts of their documentary series and aggressively fought to delay its release until after the 2020 election. The filmmakers captured ICE agents lying to immigrants to be let into their homes, officers illegally picking the lock to an apartment building during a raid, and agents mocking immigrants after they were apprehended. The docuseries, called Immigration Nation, is set to be released on Netflix next month. Protests are continuing in Portland, Oregon against racism, as well as the deployment of federal agents to the city. On Thursday, a federal judge issued a restraining order barring federal agents from using force against journalists and legal observers. Meanwhile, the Inspector General of the Justice Department has announced he'll investigate the actions of federal forces in Portland as well as in Washington, D.C. In news from Capitol Hill, 37 Democrats joined Republicans to pass a $740 billion military spending package, a $2 billion increase over last year. President Trump had threatened to veto the bill because it includes an amendment to rename military bases named after Confederate generals, but the legislation was passed by a veto-proof majority. Thursday's vote came a day after a majority of Democrats rejected a proposal to cut the Pentagon's budget by 10%. In more news from Capitol Hill, Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Thursday took to the U.S. House floor to respond to Republican Congressmember Ted Yoho of Florida after he called her a, quote, effing B-word, but he used the words, on the steps of the Capitol earlier this week.
This issue is not about one incident. It is cultural. It is a culture of lack of impunity, of accepting of violence and violent language against women, and an entire structure of power that supports that.
We will hear AOC's full fiery address after headlines. China has ordered the United States to shut its consulate in Chengdu as tensions continue to grow between the 2 superpowers. The New York Times described the Chengdu consulate as the most valuable U.S. diplomatic outpost for gathering information on Tibet, as well as Xinjiang, where China's detained Uyghur Muslims in large internment camps. Earlier this week, the Trump administration ordered the closing of China's consulate in Houston, Texas. Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry is accusing U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo of, quote, launching a new crusade against China. During an address outside the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in California, Pompeo called on other nations to join the United States to fight the, quote, new tyranny in China. More than 20 former presidents and high-level government officials in Latin America have denounced Ecuador for barring the political party of former leftist President Rafael Correa from next year's election. In an open letter, former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff and others warned that the move calls into question the legitimacy of the election. A federal judge has ordered President Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, to be released from prison into home confinement after concluding the government was trying to retaliate against him for planning to write a book about Trump to be released in the next few months. The American Civil Liberties Union, which is representing Cohen, said his re-imprisonment was a, quote, brazen assault on the First Amendment and the rule of law. The Sierra Clubs apologized for the racist views held by the conservationist John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club in 1892 and has been called the father of our national parks. Sierra Club's executive director, Michael Brune, wrote this week, quote, as defenders of black life pull down Confederate monuments across the country, we must also take this moment to re-examine our past and our substantial role in perpetuating white supremacy. It's time to take down some of our own monuments, Brune said. Meanwhile, Planned Parenthood of Greater New York has announced it's removing Margaret Sanger's name from its Manhattan Health Center because of her, quote, harmful connections to the eugenics movement, unquote. Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916 and later founded the organization that would become Planned Parenthood. Memorials for the late congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis will be held over the next week. He'll lie in state at the Alabama Capitol in Montgomery and the Capitol Rotunda in Washington. An unprecedented public viewing will also take place outside on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. This weekend, a military honor guard will accompany his body for a final crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where he was almost beaten to death in 1965 as he marched for voting rights. There's a growing movement to rename the bridge after John Lewis. Edmund Pettus was a Confederate officer, a U.S. senator, and a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the Fairfax County School Board has voted to change the name of a local high school from Robert E. Lee to John R. Lewis. In sports news, the NFL's Washington franchise has announced it'll temporarily be known as the Washington Football Team during the 2020 season. Last week, the franchise retired its old name, we'll say the R word, after years of protests from indigenous people. Meanwhile, the Cleveland Indians baseball team has announced it'll consult with Native Americans as it considers changing the team's name. And Major League Baseball began a shortened season Thursday with a game between the Washington Nationals and New York Yankees. Prior to the game, every player and coach paid tribute to the Black Lives Matter movement by taking a knee and holding a long black ribbon before the game. The initials BLM were also stamped on the pitcher's mound. Dr. Anthony Fauci threw out the first pitch. This comes weeks after the start of the National Women's Soccer League season, which began with players taking a knee during the national anthem. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with the stunning rebuke delivered by New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Florida Congressmember Ted Yoho Thursday after he was overheard by reporters calling the Congresswoman from New York an effing B-word. But he used the actual words. He was standing on the steps of the Capitol earlier this week. Her response came after Yoho offered a non-apology from the House floor on Wednesday, saying, quote, "I cannot apologize for my passion," and never naming Ocasio-Cortez directly. On Thursday, the New York Congresswoman took to the floor of the House to respond. This is her full, fiery address.
I would also like to thank many of my colleagues for the opportunity to not only speak today, but for the many members from both sides of the aisle who have reached out to me in support following an incident earlier this week. About 2 days ago, I was walking up the steps of the Capitol when Representative Yoho suddenly turned a corner, and he was accompanied by Representative Roger Williams, and accosted me on the steps right here in front of our nation's Capitol. I was minding my own business, walking up the steps, and Representative Yoho put his finger in my face. He called me disgusting. He called me crazy. He called me out of my mind. And he called me dangerous. And then he took a few more steps, and after I had recognized his comments as rude, he walked away and said, "I'm rude. You're calling me rude." I took a few steps ahead, and I walked inside and cast my vote, because my constituents send me here each and every day to fight for them and to make sure that they are able to keep a roof over their head, that they're able to feed their families, and that they're able to carry their lives with dignity. I walked back out, and there were reporters in the front of the Capitol. And in front of reporters, Representative Yoho called me, and I quote, "a f***ing bitch." These are the words that Representative Yoho levied against a congresswoman, the congresswoman that not only represents New York's 14th congressional district, but every congresswoman and every woman in this country, because all of us have had to deal with this in some form, some way, some shape, at some point in our lives. And I want to be clear that Representative Yoho's comments were not deeply hurtful or piercing to me, because I have worked a working class job. I have waited tables in restaurants. I have ridden the subway. I have walked the streets in New York City. And this kind of language is not new. I have encountered words uttered by Mr. Yoho and men uttering the same words as Mr. Yoho while I was being harassed in restaurants. I have tossed men out of bars that have used language like Mr. Yoho's. And I have encountered this type of harassment riding the subway in New York City. This is not new. And that is the problem. Mr. Yoho was not alone. He was walking shoulder to shoulder with Representative Roger Williams. And that's when we start to see that this issue is not about one incident. It is cultural. It is a culture of lack of impunity, of accepting of violence and violent language against women, and an entire structure of power that supports that. Because not only have I been spoken to disrespectfully, particularly by members of the Republican Party and elected officials in the Republican Party, not just here, but the President of the United States last year told me to go home to another country, with the implication that I don't even belong in America. The governor of Florida, Governor DeSantis, before I even was sworn in, called me a whatever that is. Dehumanizing language is not new. And what we are seeing is that incidents like these are happening in a pattern. This is a pattern of an attitude towards women and dehumanization of others. So while I was not deeply hurt or offended by little comments that are made, when I was reflecting on this, I honestly thought that I was just going to pack it up and go home. It's just another day, right? But then yesterday, Representative Yoho decided to come to the floor of the House of Representatives and make excuses for his behavior. And that I could not let go. I could not allow my nieces, I could not allow the little girls that I go home to, I could not allow victims of verbal abuse and worse to see that excuse, and to see our Congress accept it as legitimate and accept it as an apology, and to accept silence as a form of acceptance. I could not allow that to stand, which is why I am rising today to raise this point of personal privilege. And I do not need Representative Yoho to apologize to me. Clearly, he does not want to. Clearly, when given the opportunity, he will not. And I will not stay up late at night waiting for an apology from a man who has no remorse over calling women and using abusive language towards women. But what I do have issue with is using women, our wives and daughters, as shields and excuses for poor behavior. Mr. Yoho mentioned that he has a wife and 2 daughters. I am 2 years younger than Mr. Yoho's youngest daughter. I am someone's daughter, too. My father, thankfully, is not alive to see how Mr. Yoho treated his daughter. My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men. Now, what I am here to say is that this harm that Mr. Yoho tried to levy against me was not just an incident directed at me. But when you do that to any woman, What Mr. Yoho did was give permission to other men to do that to his daughters. He gave, in using that language in front of the press, he gave permission to use that language against his wife, his daughters, women in his community. And I am here to stand up to say that is not acceptable. I do not care what your views are. It does not matter how much I disagree or how much it incenses me or how much I feel that people are dehumanizing others. I will not do that myself. I will not allow people to change and create hatred in our hearts. And so what I believe is that having a daughter does not make a man decent. Having a wife does not make a decent man. Treating people with dignity and respect makes a decent man. And when a decent man messes up, as we all are bound to do, he tries his best and does apologize. Not to save face, not to win a vote. He apologizes genuinely to repair and acknowledge the harm done so that we can all move on. Lastly, what I want to express to Mr. Yoho is gratitude. I want to thank him for showing the world that you can be a powerful man and accost women. You can have daughters and accost women without remorse. You can be married and accost women. You can take photos and project an image to the world of being a family man and accost women without remorse and with a sense of impunity. It happens every day in this country. It happened here on the steps of our nation's capital. It happens when individuals who hold the highest office in this land admit to hurting women and using this language against all of us.
New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez firing back at Florida Congressmember Ted Yoho after he called the Congresswoman from New York an effing B-word, but he actually used the words. This is Democracy Now! One Congress member after another followed AOC to express their support for her. When we come back, Professor Noam Chomsky. Stay with us. By Janelle Monáe featuring Erykah Badu. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Barely 100 days before the presidential election in November, this week, President Trump announced he's sending a surge of federal officers into large Democrat-run cities like Chicago. This comes after Trump first sent federal agents to Portland, Oregon, where the camouflage-clad paramilitary agents attacked anti-racist protesters, even snatched activists off the streets in unmarked vans. On Wednesday night, when federal forces fired tear gas at protesters in Portland once again, among those hit was Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler, who also serves as Portland's police commissioner. The response to Trump's outrageous and likely unconstitutional deployment of federal agents has been resoundingly critical. Oregon Governor Kate Brown denounced the, quote, secret police abducting people. And the Oregon Attorney General has now sued several of the federal agencies involved. In the streets, a contingent of women has grown nightly, protecting protesters by forming a wall of moms. Oregon Senator Ron Wyden described the federal agents as essentially fascist and warned, quote, if the line is not drawn in the sand right now, America may be staring down the barrel of martial law in the middle of a presidential election. Well, for more on this and much more, we spend the rest of the hour with Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author, laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, and professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than 50 years. He spoke with Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh and I on Thursday. We reached him at his home in Tucson, Arizona, where he's sheltering in place with his wife, Valeria. I began by asking Professor Chomsky to respond to the surge of federal agents Trump is promising to unleash on the country.
President Trump is desperate. His entire attention is there's one issue on his mind, that's the election. He has to cover up for the fact that he's personally responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans. It's impossible to conceal that much longer. Just compare the United States with Europe or even Canada. It's becoming a pariah state. To the point where Americans aren't even permitted to travel to Europe. Europe won't accept them. His chances of victory depend on his doing something dramatic. He was trying very hard to set up military confrontations. You mentioned martial law. It's moving towards martial law. He might even be able to try to cancel the elections. There's no telling what he would do. He's completely desperate. This is like the actions of some tin pot dictator in a neo-colony somewhere, small country that has a military coup every couple of years. There's no historical precedent for anything like this in a functioning democratic society. If he could send black shirts out in the streets, he'd be happy to do that. Exactly how this will eventuate is very hard to say. The courts are unlikely to do anything. We may even get to a point where the military command has to decide which side they're on. The man is desperate. He's psychotic. He is in extreme danger of losing his position in the White House. He'll do anything he can to prevent it.
Well, Professor Chomsky, I mean, you've just echoed the concerns of Senator Ron Wyden that the U.S. may be headed towards the imposition of martial law. You've just called Trump a psychotic, previously having referred to him as a sociopath, and pointed to the differences the massive differences between Biden and Trump when we had you on earlier this year, saying about Biden that he's pretty empty, you can push him one way or another. And you've also said that this is the most crucial election in human history, literally. Now, in a Fox News interview just on Sunday, Trump refused to commit to accepting the outcome of the 2020 election.
I'm not a good loser. I don't like to lose. I don't lose too often. I don't like to lose.
But are you gracious?
You don't know until you see. It depends. I think mail-in voting is going to rig the election. I really do.
Are you suggesting that you might not accept the results of the election?
I have to see. Look, Hillary Clinton asked me the same thing.
Could you comment on that and what your concerns are in the event? I mean, you've just said that, in fact, the elections somehow could be canceled. Could you talk about under what conditions Trump might be able to do that? And in the event that they're not canceled, what are your concerns depending on the outcome of the vote, what Trump might do?
Well, there are various maneuvers that theoretically they might undertake. One might be to try to throw the election to the to refuse to accept the vote, to make sure that the Republican governors don't authorize their own electors. This is routine and automatic, but technically they could refuse, could throw it into the House where there's enough Republicans in the House to essentially turn the election into the kind of farce that you find in as I said, in some tin-pot dictatorship. That's one possibility. Another possibility is he might just try to call out the military to impose martial law. And the point is he cannot lose. First of all, he's psychologically incapable of losing. Secondly, if he loses, if he leaves the White House, he may be facing serious legal problems. Now he has immunity, but there's a whole swamp around him. He's tried to keep it from being investigated. He fired all the inspectors general when they were beginning to investigate it. The federal attorney for the Southern District of New York, that's Wall Street and so on, the most important, started looking into it, fired him, replaced him with a flack from the private equity industry. There's nothing he would not do to try to maintain office. Virtually nothing you can think of. This is a major crisis. There's been one or another form of parliamentary democracy for 350 years in England, 250 years here, and nothing like this has happened before. We're dealing with a figure who's out of the political spectrum for functioning democracies, and he has a political party behind him which by now has just turned into cowardly sycophants. They're terrified to cross his imperial majesty. He's got a popular base of heavily armed, angry, white supremacist militias. There's no telling what he would do. I think the country is, by November, maybe a different country and a different world given U.S. power. But that's kind of the immediate issue. The reason why this is the most important election in history has nothing to do with this. 4 more years of Trump's climate policies and nuclear policies might simply doom the human species, literally. We don't have a lot of time to deal with the environmental crisis. It's very serious. Every prediction that's been made by scientists has been too conservative. Each time it comes out worse. I won't run through the details, but it's a major catastrophe looming. We have some time to deal with it. 4 more years of Trump might well take us to irreversible tipping points. At the very least, it will make it much harder to confront this growing crisis. There's no stopping the polar ice caps from ice sheets from melting, the Amazon forest from being destroyed. Large parts of the world might become simply unlivable. We're talking about potential sea rises of maybe 1 or 2 feet by the end of the century, much more later. This is all totally catastrophic. You can't conceive of how human society can survive in an organized way. At the same time, Trump is dedicated to destroying the arms control regime. Last August, he terminated the Reagan-Gorbachev INF treaty, which helped control the potential for nuclear war growing from a European conflict. Now he's dismantle the Open Skies Treaty. Goes back to Eisenhower. That's gone. He's imposed frivolous demands to try to delay negotiations on the New START Treaty, which the Russians have been pleading for a long time. This is due for renewal in a few months. It may already be too late to renegotiate it. The last of the arms control treaties. He's now threatening to carry out nuclear weapons tests that would undermine the comprehensive test ban treaty. Almost 30 years. The United States never ratified it, but it's lived up to it. All of this opens the door wider for other countries to react the same way. It's the arms industry is, of course, euphoric. They're getting huge new contracts to develop major weapons to destroy all of us. This encourages others to do the same, so there are new contracts down the road for hopeless means to try to defend ourselves against the monstrosities that we're helping to construct. Now, this is Trump racing towards this, apparently enjoying it. It's a kind of, you can't describe it in normal terms. It's the term you use, sociopath, is perfectly accurate. Whether this can be contained within the constitutional structures of the United States, we don't know. I mean, something similar to this happened in the United Kingdom a couple of months ago. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, prorogated the Parliament, closed the Parliament, so that he could ram through his version of Brexit. This was regarded by British legal experts as the worst crisis in 350 years. Well, in Britain, the Supreme Court nullified it. That's unlikely to happen here. I might say that there's another country that's trying to mimic the United States, Brazil, with another ridiculous dictator, Jair Bolsonaro, who's trying to be a clone of Trump. He was being investigated by, he and his family involved in all kind of sordid criminal activities, came under investigation. He fired the investigators, but that was blocked by the courts in Brazil, not here. When Trump fired them all, purged the executive, nothing from the courts, nothing from the Republicans in Congress. Brazil at least has a thin barrier to another military dictatorship. The United States is in worse shape. This is pretty serious. There's been nothing like it. There's no precedents that have any real relevance.
Well, Professor Chomsky, you've mentioned again now the lack of safeguards there are in the U.S. to the possible imposition of martial law. But even in other countries around the world where martial law has been declared, it requires minimally the compliance of those who are in charge of the military. Do you see those in the U.S. going along with Trump in the event that he chooses to attempt to declare martial law?
As I say, there's no precedent for this in any minimally functioning democracy. There are countries, many of them, where the military is taken over, often with U.S. support or even initiative, because we wanted to overthrow the civilian government. And nothing like this has happened since, aside from the fascist regimes, interwar regimes, totally different conditions. There's just no precedent. There was, as you may recall, a couple of weeks ago, press reports with headlines about how Trump is expanding his purge of the executive which has almost been cleansed of any controls or dissident voices, is extending this to trying to purge the military. Well, there were speculations at the time that the purge of the military might be preparation for a plan to try to bring the military in to carry out something which would amount to a military coup. The military so far has been refusing, pulled out the 82nd Airborne from Washington after Trump wanted it in there. They've been rejecting the proposals from the White House for more force and violence. That's why he's resorting to forces outside the official military in his current campaign to set up violent confrontations in Democratic-run cities planned right now. What the military would do, we don't know. If you look for precedents in third world dictatorships, it would depend on how those at the colonel level react, people close in contact with troops. But we have no precedent for anything like this. There's nothing like it. This is a unique situation in modern history, in the modern history of the democratic, more or less democratic societies.
MIT Professor Emeritus Noam Chomsky, linguist, author, activist. When we come back, I ask him about President Trump bragging about acing a cognitive test for dementia. All that and more in a minute.
I spent the whole day in my head, do a little spring cleaning. I'm always too busy dreaming. Well, maybe I should wake up instead. A lot of things I regret, but I just say I forget. Why can't it just be easy? Why does everybody need me to stay? Oh, I hate the feeling when you're high but you're underneath the ceiling. Got the cards in my hand, I hate dealing. Then I'm gone, but it ain't stealing. Can I get a break? I wish that I could just get out my goddamn way. What is there to say? There ain't a better time than today.
Good news by Mac Miller. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We're spending the hour with Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist and author, laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, Tucson, and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than 50 years. Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh and I spoke to him Thursday. Noam Chomsky, I wanted to play for you what President Trump said on Fox News about the cognitive test he recently took, saying it was difficult.
I took a test. I said to the doctor, it was Dr. Ronnie Jackson, I said, is there some kind of a test, an acuity test? And he said there actually is, and he named it, whatever it might be. And it was 30 or 35 questions. The first questions are very easy. The last questions are much more difficult, like a memory question. It's like you'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. So they say, could you repeat that? So I said, yeah. So it's person, woman, man, camera, TV. Okay, that's very good. If you get it in order, you get extra points.
President Trump saying he aced his test for dementia. Keeps talking about acing this cognitive test, a test that's given to see if someone is suffering from dementia, some kind of cognitive difficulties. This isn't an IQ test. He continually goes back to it. Even when told, you're asking to identify an elephant, you're being asked to draw a clock, to count back from 100 by sevens. This is a test to see if a person is becoming senile. Is the United States being run by a madman, Noam Chomsky?
As you say, the test is given for dementia, incipient dementia, a serious mental illness. But what can you say about a person who, before speaking before an adoring crowd, raises his eyes to heaven and calls himself the chosen one? What can you say about an administration where the Secretary of State says perhaps Trump has been sent by the good Lord to save Israel from Iran? The country's being run by madmen. There's no parallels to this. In fact, you can see it in everything that's happening. You go back to late March or so, the United States was about the same as Europe in number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. It was roughly the same. Take a look at the chart since. Europe has sharply declined. It's not over the problems. It's not doing as well as Asia or Oceania, but way down. The United States remains stable. You look at the medical journals, they point out that Trump's malfeasance and incompetence, or just lack of concern for the welfare of the population, has killed maybe 100,000 people. It's a pretty significant slaughter. Now, that's why he's flailing around wildly to find somebody to blame it on. That's why he's using the current opportunity to send quasi-military forces, more or less paramilitary, to set up violent confrontations with Democratic mayors and governors. I mean, there's no precedent for sending militarized forces to control a city in opposition when there's total opposition on the part of the mayor, the governor, the senators, obviously the population. This is treating the country like occupied territory, and with a purpose, totally clear purpose of trying to set up confrontations which will somehow save him from electoral defeat. And if there is defeat, he may just refuse to leave the White House, as he intimated in Fox News the other day, in which case you really have to ask what happens next. Does the military move in and remove him? Or what happens when armed militias start surrounding the White House? We don't know. This is a situation which has never arisen in a functioning democracy apart from the fascist takeovers in Italy and Germany, some other countries in the interwar period. Trump is sometimes, even by experts on the topic, called moving towards fascism. I think, frankly, that gives him much too much credit. Fascism was a serious ideology. I think it's well beyond his ken or concern. This is more like a minor dictator in a small country that's subjected to military coups over the years. There's no conception of introducing real fascist ideology. In fact, in some ways, we're almost the opposite of it. The fascist systems were based on the principle that the powerful state, and under the leadership of the ruling party and the maximal leader, should basically control everything. They should run and control the society, including the business community. We're almost the opposite. It's the business community controlling the government, and any infringement on their power would lead to a kind of confrontation that is almost unimaginable. So I don't think it's fascism. It's essentially tin pot dictatorship. And he's desperate and will do anything, almost anything imaginable, to try to keep himself from being tossed out of the White House. How this will eventuate, we don't know, but it's going to be a very difficult couple of months ahead.
You talk about those in power, Noam Chomsky, profiting enormously now. You have Goldman Sachs reporting over $2.4 billion in second quarter profits. A new study by Americans for Tax Fairness found U.S. billionaires have added $584 billion to their personal wealth since March. That's a greater amount than the budget shortfalls of 23 U.S. states. They're making these profits in the midst of the pandemic. And on the one hand, when you need stimulus packages to help those who are being crushed, who are soon to be evicted, when we're talking about economic situation, the unemployed, to a level we haven't seen since the Great Depression. You write about this and speak about this. How do people dig themselves out? What needs to happen right now in this country, Noam?
Well, what you're describing is the way that is kind of the country is in a kind of a parody of the way it usually runs. It's a country run by essentially by the corporate sector, which has overwhelming influence on the government. And what you describe is quite correct. It's kind of symbolized by the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, who made $13 billion in a single day. They're just running wild. Using the Trump and the administration are using the cover of the pandemic to increase their dedication to enriching the very rich and the corporate sector, who are, of course, eating it up. They love it. I mentioned military industry. That's another example of it. Sure, that's you might regard it as a last-ditch effort to try to impose the maximal rule of extreme wealth and corporate power, running parallel to the Mitch McConnell, Trump campaign to pack the judiciary top to bottom with young, ultra-right Federalist Society lawyers who will be able to make sure that no matter what the public wants, nothing but their ultra-reactionary policies will ever be able to be implemented for at least a generation. They're running on all stops to try to maintain what they've succeeded in largely getting through the neoliberal period, the last 40 years. Enormous concentration of wealth, concentration of political power, general population stagnating, declining, even to the point where there's an increase in mortality in the last few years among working age people, white working age men and mostly men, some women. Nothing like this happens in functioning, developed societies. The Republicans know very well that they're a minority party. Trump, in fact, pointed out not long ago that if there were fair elections, the Republicans would never win a political office. The country is basically, for a long time, has been pretty much a one-party state, a business party, two factions. They've changed over time. The last several decades, pretty much since Gingrich, and extensively since McConnell, the Republicans have just gone off the spectrum, off the political spectrum. If you look at international rankings, they're ranked alongside the European parties with neo-fascist backgrounds. Political analysts, serious political analysts, describe them as a radical insurgency that's abandoned parliamentary politics. We talked a couple days ago with Greg Palast, whose very interesting work has shown the extent to which they're desperately trying to purge electoralists to prevent the wrong people from voting, so somehow they can hang on. All of this is happening in parallel along with what you described, a massive enrichment of the super rich in the corporate sector under the cover of the pandemic. Every couple of days, some other executive decision or decision of one of Trump, the corporate clones, corporate figures who's Trump placed in charge of the various agencies like the EPA, passing further legislation to smash the public in the face and enrich the rich, like cutting back pollution standards, which of course is great for the coal companies. They're hanging on by a thread, but we can keep them going longer to cause maximal destruction to organized human society. Also the pollution, which right in the middle of a respiratory pandemic, increasing pollution, of course, maximizes deaths, and it's selective. It's the people who live near the polluting factories. Who are they? The people who can't afford to live anywhere else. You don't see Goldman Sachs executives living there. What you see is poor, black, Hispanic, Puerto Ricans. They're the ones who will take the brunt of it. They're already suffering much worse from the pandemic. This will make it worse. It's kind of similar to what you see in Brazil, where Bolsonaro is quite happy to see the indigenous populations of the Amazonian region are facing literal genocide, first from destruction of the forest, now from the pandemic. Many of them live hundreds of miles from the nearest health station. Illegal loggers come in, spread the pandemic, they die. You think Bolsonaro minds? He thinks they ought to be eliminated. He said so. We don't need those people. So let's get rid of them altogether. So let's get rid of the people who are living near the polluting industries. Who needs them? They vote the wrong way anyway. They're the wrong color. This is something happening in the world under the U.S. aegis, which is literally unparalleled in modern history. Again, with the single exception of the true fascist states in developed society. There's no other words to describe it.
Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author, laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona and professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than 50 years. Next week, we'll bring you more of Noam Chomsky. That does it for our broadcast. If you'd like to get our newsletter daily, text the word Democracy Now! To 66866. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Taymari Astudio, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Honey Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe, save lives, wear a mask.